Today we have Charles Cyna from ThinkITSM joining us on Thought Rock Live with a special two-part webcast series. Charles is an industry thought leader, excellent presenter, and a regular Thought Rock contributor. We're thrilled to have him kick off our 2013 webcast season. We've been off for a bit and we're happy to be back. Charles is presenting a special two-part webcast series titled Building a Customer Satisfaction Survey that Drives Service Improvement. So we're starting off with part one today, and part two will be next week, Tuesday, January the 22nd. Today, Charles will be exploring different methodologies for establishing a customer satisfaction baseline and learning how IT organizations can build a sustainable, holistic customer satisfaction measurement system that will drive service improvement. Next week, he'll be discussing how organizations can now implement these systems, execute surveys, and measure results. Charles has been working with organizations for over 16 years in the IT service management industry, helping to address efficiencies and improve customer support by deploying new service management tools. He's the co-founder and president of ThinkITSM, where dedicated service management practitioners have been engaging organizations to rethink how they measure themselves, bring service improvement to the center of their IT's activities. As president of ThinkITSM, Charles' focus is to ensure that ThinkITSM continues to provide the best measurement experience for IT service desks around the world. With all that, and with that introduction, I'd like to turn it over now to Charles. Charles.
Thank you very much, Rick, and welcome everyone to this presentation. I appreciate you taking your time out of your busy day to learn or to talk about customer satisfaction. When putting together this presentation, I had three main objectives that I want to share with you today. Surveying, when I talk to lots of different organizations, I find that surveying is one of those topics that a lot of people are doing. However, there's some level of dissatisfaction with how the surveying is potentially going within the organization. So one of the things that we wanted to do today was to really share a simplified methodology that any service desk or IT department could really easily deploy within their environment and get results relatively quickly. I wanted to look at what organizations that I've been working with are doing and what's been successful and some of the challenges that people have faced. And today we also wanted to provide everyone with the opportunity to move through the survey creation process. And at the end of today, we're going to give everyone an opportunity to go to a portal where you can actually go and create a survey that we've been in the same kind of way that we've been talking about and actually put it into practice if you wish to do so. So without any further ado, let me just give you a quick sort of outline of our presentation today. We're going to look at client satisfaction. What is it? Is it even a good idea for IT to measure client satisfaction? Some organizations actually experience low client satisfaction, and we want to understand what the reasons are behind that. In other organizations, we find that they actually get inflated satisfaction scores, and we want to explore some of the reasons why that is the case. We're going to look at the different types of surveys that you can build for the different stakeholder groups within your organization. So IT has potentially multiple stakeholder groups that you might want to survey, and we want to explore the different types of surveys that you would use for each of these stakeholder groups. And then we're going to look at how you can actually develop an action plan of improvement based on what the data is telling you. We talk about in our subject line that this is about surveying to impact performance improvement. I think a lot of organizations go with the surveying part, but then being able to tie that back into a performance improvement program becomes a bit of a challenge. And so we're going to try and establish the link between surveying and performance improvements. So where do we start? Well, we start, as in many areas within IT service management, really with baselining. And the baseline that we're going to talk about, and that I'm really just going to ask you to think about, is do you care about client satisfaction? For example, if you're an Amazon, would you survey your customers, in terms of their experience with their portal? If you're a retail outlet, your customers are your stores. The thing to think about, who in fact are our clients in IT, and do we care about what they think? How are we capturing client satisfaction information? Are we surveying today? And if we are surveying, who are we doing it? How frequently do we survey? And then finally, what are we doing with the information? So let's explore each one of these things in turn. In terms of client satisfaction, should we measure it? Some of the things that I've heard in the past, and I'm just going to throw them up here, is that at the end of the day, the users are really, a captive audience. They are going to call IT whether they want to or not. IT is, a monopoly within the organization, and so at the end of the day, does it really matter? A lot of organizations are pulling funding out of service desks and pushing that funding, elsewhere, and at the same time, you're going to see client satisfaction potentially drop. Additionally, some organizations are outsourcing service desks to far-flung places around the world, and potentially that's impacting client satisfaction. And then the final comment is, well, are these people customers anyway? I mean, at the end of the day, if we're in IT, we might be supporting our end users, and so the question is, should we be, should we even be, calling our end users customers? These are all valid questions, and let's explore the answers. I think client satisfaction is important because of a number of things. And I'm just going to sort of go off the top points that have occurred to me over my workings. Number one, it maintains morale. And this is actually an important thing because a service desk can do 20,000 things great, and then they do one thing wrong, and all people do is really focus on that one thing wrong, and it becomes sort of it becomes one of those sort of fables within the organization that basically, that's what we're going to focus on. We don't focus on the 20,000 things we did great. And the reality is for IT to be great, no one really talks about it. IT is typically talked about when things aren't going great. And so we need to establish some of these measurements to help us remember that we do a great job most of the time, and the fact is that people do appreciate what we do, and morale is important in a team such as the service desk and IT support chain. Customer satisfaction really does improve the perception of IT within the organization. We don't just take the pulse of client satisfaction or customer satisfaction and just share it internally. We potentially share that information outside of IT. And again, it's to counteract these stories that people typically remember where we might have dropped the ball once or twice rather than the thousands or tens of thousands of times that we didn't drop the ball and we did a great job. Is IT a monopoly? Well, IT probably used to be a monopoly, but it really isn't a monopoly anymore. We know now that cloud computing has really gained momentum. Organizations have deployed CRM systems out in the cloud. People are deploying service management systems out in the cloud, HR systems, ERP systems. Pretty much almost anything that you could have built internally is now available from a cloud provider. And so where in the past IT was really responsible for building all of this infrastructure, IT might now be responsible for just managing the relationship between these different cloud providers over time. And the role of IT is changing. Historically, IT has been sort of a builder of infrastructure, and it's moving to a broker of infrastructure. I think I even have a slide here that sort of talks about some of the things that have been going on that's sort of impacting IT. From a business perspective, we've seen the economic downturn. Organizations are looking at ways that they can continually reduce their cost cycles. At the same time, we're going through an unprecedented period of technology proliferation. Just 5 years ago, we didn't have Android devices or these tablets or iPhones or whatever it happened to be, and now organizations are deploying them very, very rapidly. At the same time, globalization has accelerated, where organizations are looking at different departments and they're saying if there's a commodity within our environment that we can push it off somewhere else within the world and deliver it more cheaply, we're going to do that. And that's most commonly seen in manufacturing, where American and Canadian organizations are doing their manufacturing in Asia as opposed to North America. IT responds to all of these business drivers, and IT responds by typically reducing costs. IT is in many cases considered to be a cost, rightly or wrongly, within the organization, and so they're sometimes said, okay, well, we have to reduce costs across the board, and at the same time they're going through this role evolution, and the role evolution goes from a transition that's happening over the next sort of 10 to 15 years, where historically IT was a builder of infrastructure, and they're moving to become a broker of infrastructure. And so as more and more IT components get pushed out to the cloud, IT's role is really about brokering the relationships between these providers and potentially the last pieces of infrastructure that IT controls. While all this is happening, the service desk really has a challenge. And it's really a service delivery challenge that's basically saying, how do we show value to the business? And one of the best ways of showing value to the business is, delivering a level of quality service. And one of the key, quality measures is around customer satisfaction or client satisfaction. It helps service desks or help desks to move away from break-fix to other value-added services. A lot of service desks or help desks in the past are very activity-focused. When I look at a lot of the outputs from service desks, they're always about volume. And historically, people used to be very excited about volume reports because it meant that if we're busy, it means that we're valuable. But the world has kind of changed a little bit. Nobody really cares so much anymore about whether we're busy. People care more about, well, how much quality or how valuable are we in the work that we're doing? Because if we're just busy, I can potentially get lower cost resources to do that work somewhere else. However, if we're delivering some level of quality, it's much more difficult to transfer quality than it is to transfer activity. And then finally, we find that customer satisfaction really underpins a metric around service value, okay, or service desk value. And if we look at what service desk value is, and if I ask CIOs, what is the value of the service desk, often you're going to get a very long-winded answer. If you boil it down to its bare essentials, service desk really is there to provide a level of quality at the lowest possible cost, so high quality at low cost. That's kind of what's there. And if you look at the historical reason why we have service desk, it's basically because we don't want people, consuming time of high-cost resources and DBAs to resolve repetitive incidents that are occurring in our environment. So cost was really the #1 driving factor as to why service desks are actually in place. But of course, if we just drive down costs, our quality is probably going to be pretty low, and then people will bypass the support chain or the service desk and go and try and contact people directly. So we have to keep a level of quality that actually makes the service valuable. And so it really becomes this balance where I need to have quality high enough that people are going to use it, but I need to keep costs low enough that basically justify the existence of the service desk and the cost savings that we have in place. So in terms of what happens with client satisfaction, what could you do with what could you do with that score? Well, you could put it into a scorecard, and we have a continual service improvement scorecard that I recommend organizations look at. And something like this is where you have sort of these quality measures over on the left-hand side. You have these cost measures. You might have some quality cost measures. And the very first measure that you might put in a scorecard like this is client satisfaction. And client satisfaction might actually weigh up to 30% of your total overall improvement scorecard when you're actually taking client satisfaction and improving and implementing it as part of a service improvement program. In our next presentation, we're going to actually look at this in a little bit more detail and explain how client satisfaction sits within the service improvement program and what you actually need to do to create one of these service improvement programs. So going back to customer satisfaction in itself, I figured it's important for us to sort of put some definitions up on the screen and even determine what exactly is customer satisfaction. And the first thing that it's important to realize is the customer satisfaction or the measurement of customer satisfaction is definitely nothing new. And I kind of looked at a bunch of texts, one from 1977, one from 1982, one from 1988, and I just basically picked out some summaries of what I thought was, really good abstracts to sort of give us definitions of certainly what customer satisfaction is and also why it's so challenging to measure. So Hunt basically said that it's an evaluation rendered that the experience was at least as good as it was supposed to be. Okay? And you can kind of you're going to get a copy of this deck, and so you can kind of look at some of this stuff offline, but I actually think that these definitions are actually kind of pretty cool. An evaluation that the chosen alternative is consistent with the prior beliefs with respect to that alternative. this really kind of provides some insight into some of the challenges of customer satisfaction, that we're actually dealing with individuals' prior beliefs with respect to what they might have experienced somewhere else to determine whether they're actually going to be satisfied with the service. It's something so subjective that actually proves to be very difficult to in fact measure. And then the final one I just want to share with you is that client or customer satisfaction can be the consumer response to the evaluation of the perceived discrepancy between prior expectation and the actual performance of the service as perceived after its consumption. You're probably like going, oh my God. I've actually read this one like about 30 times, and it really is worth kind of like going through. But it's really all about, is the experience that I'm being provided with now, how does it match up to my prior experiences, which are informing what I expect from my current experience? So if we don't meet people's customer expectations and we have low customer satisfaction, there's actually only a certain number of reasons why customer satisfaction is low. And it's important to understand what those reasons are, because if you're going to fix low customer satisfaction, it's important to identify which bucket or multiple buckets you potentially fill in. And there's basically 5 things that can cause low customer satisfaction or low client satisfaction. Gap number 1 is what we call the promotional gap. This is where what is said about the service differs from what is delivered. A great example of the promotional gap is when you call up any large organization, and the very first thing that they say when you're holding on the line for 20 minutes is that this call is important to us. Now, it personally drives me crazy, because I know that if this call was really important to them, I would go to the front of the line. And recently, I'll just go, share an anecdote. I became a frequent flyer with a particular airline, and prior to me becoming sort of frequent fly status, I used to be online, 30, 40, 50 minutes, waiting to speak to someone. Now I became a frequent flyer. I basically dial a special number and I speak to someone within, 10 seconds, every single time. It's unbelievable. And so, the promotional gap, is really important. If the organization is saying that, they provide, this amazing service, and that is different from what you're experiencing, it's going to cause, dissatisfaction. So it's important to have your messaging in line with the type of service that you're actually providing. The gap number 2 is what we call the understanding gap. And this is where the service provider, so the IT support group, the IT service perception of consumer expectation is inaccurate. So this is where we haven't actually gone out and spoken to our consumers or our customers and found out what their expectation is in terms of the level of support that they're going to be provided. And in a hospital, for example, where lives are potentially on the line or the patients are being impacted, IT support potentially presents a level of criticality that it might not in a general office environment. The same is true if I'm at a law firm and I'm basically dealing with lawyers who maybe are earning $400 or $500 an hour, and every minute that they can't be billable is a direct impact to the revenue of the organization. So it becomes really important to understand what is the expectation level of the customer to be able to bridge this particular gap. Gap number 3 is what we call the procedural gap. This is where the customer or the consumer expectation is not translated into appropriate procedures. And this would be the case where my consumer would be expecting to get a resolution at first call resolution, for example. And yet my IT department has set up a service desk as a dispatch center. And so from a process perspective, I'm really going to have a mismatch from my user's expectation. They're expecting an answer when I call somebody up, but from IT's perspective, they basically are always going to be assigning calls to second-line support because they've really got a dispatch center in place as opposed to a fully functioning service desk. Gap number 4 is what we call the behavioral gap. And this is where the service being delivered is different from the specification of the service. So a great example of this would be where in IT, you've got second-line or third-line support personnel who aren't following the incident management process, and they're kind of going off and doing their own thing. There might be pockets of excellence that occur in the organization, but the process isn't being implemented in a repeatable, consistent way, and so we're really providing dissatisfaction because we're not following the rules. And then gap number 5 is what we call the perception gap, the level of service perceived by consumers differs from the service actually provided. And this really comes from that situation where IT doesn't start telling enough good stories about what they do, and so only the bad stories are the things that take hold within the culture of the organization, and they take on a life of themselves. And so IT is not only responsible for solving issues and getting back to people and doing all of the operational type stuff, they're also responsible with controlling the story that is being told, and that people understand that there are actually a lot of great things that are happening, and we need to tell people about those things. Okay, so if you have a customer satisfaction deficit, pretty much any one of them could be fit into one of these 5 gaps. And once you understand that, it's quite easy to put a plan in place to hopefully address those deficiencies or those deficits. So obviously, there must be some challenges in client satisfaction. Otherwise, everyone would be doing it. So, and everyone would be happy with how they're doing it. So these are some of the questions that we're going to be asking right now, and we're going to put a suggested approach in place. So number one, how do we make scoring objective? We're taking something that is very subjective from an individual person's perspective, and we want to get from that an objective overall score. Okay. The second thing is, how do we make scoring relevant over time? I look a lot at the way a lot of surveys are designed, and they have individual questions that make it very difficult to change those questions over time if you want to make the scoring relevant. So for example, if I'm asking people how satisfied they are with regard to how quickly we're answering the telephone, and then I decide to change that question in 3 months to another type of question, how do I translate the score that I got for the old question to the score I get to the new question in a meaningful way? So we need to understand, how do we do that? Do some surveys overestimate or underestimate the satisfaction scores of recipients? And how do we even know that we're doing that? Who should we be measuring? And how should we be measuring? Okay, so the who is, I talked about these stakeholder groups. And then, the how is, well, what is the measure? Do we interview people? Do we send out email surveys? What are the mechanisms in place that we can actually implement to actually enable these things to happen? So let's just look at a suggested approach that we can take. So number one, we're going to say, okay, we don't just want to survey. We want to have a goal for the processing of the results. So we don't want to just survey for surveying's sake. We want to basically survey, and we want to do something with the information. And my suggestion is the stuff that we want to do with the information is really performance improvement, because everyone gets excited about performance improvement. You don't want to gather the information for a witch hunt. You don't want to gather the information just to necessarily blow your trumpet, although that is potentially a side thing that you can potentially do. But really it's about creating an environment of improvement, and you can take these results and establish that. The second thing is that you're going to need some type of framework. Now the good news is that there are literally hundreds of frameworks out there that you could take advantage of. And the bad news is that there are literally hundreds of frameworks out there that you can take advantage of. And it actually is quite confusing. Recently I was looking at measurements. Someone was asking me, what are the top measures that every service desk should measure? And I was like thinking, what? There are literally thousands of sites out there that basically list every single KPI that you could possibly want to measure for your service desk. And so I actually went to a lot of these sites, and I realized that the challenge is that there are thousands of these sites with literally every measure that you could possibly imagine to measure ITSM or service desk or IT support. So it's really about picking the right ones for you. That's obviously the challenge. So it's picking a repeatable framework that works, and we're going to be presenting a framework that we've seen work in a few hundred organizations that's been quite successful. You want to decide upon the stakeholder groups that are going to have the most impact in terms of your measurement. So I'm talking here about consumers, so these might be end users within an organization, and practitioners. These are the IT staff who are potentially doing the work. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those folks in a few moments. You want to talk about your survey frequency. Are you going to do a transactional survey, or an annual survey, or maybe a combination of both. The transactional survey would be a survey that goes out after an individual transaction between you and your customer. For example, if they called the service desk, you could send out a transactional survey that said, how did we do on that particular case? And then once a year, you could send out an overall perception survey to get a pulse of where the organization is that doesn't actually relate to a specific transaction. And then you want to have some type of plan in place that's going to help you build improvements around the results of the survey. So you know you're going to survey, so that's great. You spend all that time on the survey, but then you need to have a plan in place to actually do something with the results. So the survey.
Hey, Charles, quick question for you. So how long does it typically, for an organization, how long does it typically take kind of start to finish to implement this type of surveying approach?
So a surveying approach could actually be implemented in the best case scenario within 30 days. And typically it could be 60 days, but no more than that. And I think that if it goes any longer, you basically start losing the momentum of improvement that you're trying to make, and so you're probably making it a little bit too complicated. And I've been in environments, for example, where everybody's input is solicited, and this process can actually go on for months, and it actually becomes crippling, and then nothing, basically happens. And so, leveraging a proven model, can actually speed up the process quite substantially. So, so we have our survey set up. We're going to agree to a measurement model. We're going to identify the recipients and the frequency. We're going to perform a baseline survey. We want to perform a baseline survey because we want to tell a story. And everyone knows to tell a great story, you need to have a beginning. And the baseline is the beginning of my story. If I don't baseline, I don't have a beginning of the story. And so when I do all these fantastic things in improving my performance, I'm never going to be able to go back and look at what a great job we did or where we came from. So that baseline is really important. So to do baseline survey execution, we're going to distribute surveys. We're going to monitor the performance. We close off those surveys, and then we do the analysis. And then basically, after we've done the analysis, we prepare an executive summary. And we report back to managers, and the process kind of looks like this. We define the objectives. We're going to develop some research. We're going to design the questionnaire. We're going to design a sampling plan. We're going to pre-test the program. We're going to gather data. We're going to analyze the data. We're going to use the data. And what we're going to just quickly do is just look at where we are in each step. So defining the objectives. What do we want to do with the information that we gather? Are we going to benchmark ourselves against other organizations? I know there are services out there right now that will benchmark your customer satisfaction against other organizations doing customer satisfaction. Is there value in that? Do you want to just do it so that you're knowing that you're doing a good job? Are there other reasons? Well, my personal belief is that the best reason to do customer surveying is to help you improve performance. And I like leveraging the ITIL Continual Service Improvement model. So this, for anyone who's familiar with the Continual Service Improvement book in ITIL version 3, this is the 6-step model. And I like it because it's easy to understand and it's pretty easy to implement. And it's kind of common sense, and things that are common sense kind of get everybody on board. And the common sense thing is, you say, where are we now, that baseline piece. You talk about where do you want to be. You're going to figure out how you're going to get there, and you're going to measure whether you got there or not. So part of customer satisfaction really sits in here under baseline assessments. It sits in here under measurable targets, because your baseline is going to be, let's say your baseline is 3 out of 5, and your measurable target of where you want to be is 4 out of 5. And then you have to basically put a plan in place as to how you're going to go from 3 out of 5 to 4 out of 5. Okay, and so this model really becomes easy to implement to help you move from wherever you are on your baseline to wherever you need to be in your target state. Step number 2, we're going to develop the research design. Okay, so what methods are we going to use to collect the information? How are we going to gather the information, and who are we going to gather the information from? So let's look at some of the options here. You can send out surveys. So surveys are the most popular things to do because they're relatively inexpensive, and it's pretty easy to get responses back from individuals, and it's really good to be able to analyze that information. However, I don't necessarily think it's the only thing that you could do. One of the things that I've seen work very effectively is the old mystery shopper technique, where someone from IT pretends to be a consumer or an end user or a customer or whatever you want to call them, and they call up the service desk and they basically talk about their experience on a number of scenarios, and they might follow 3 or 4 scenarios of tickets, and they might grade their experience that they had when they called the service desk. I like it because, again, it's inexpensive, and it provides another perspective in terms of information that you can potentially gather. The final one that I've actually seen that works very nicely are consumer visits or even focus groups. And this is where you invite a group of your consumers together and you ask them questions about their experience. So this is a little bit more expensive to do. It's more time-consuming to do. However, it does provide, again, additional details as to the experience that you're providing, and it provides a level of insight that you potentially don't get in a survey where someone is just spending a couple of minutes filling out an electronic form versus pulling someone out of their job for maybe half an hour or 45 minutes. I'm really getting an understanding of what their experiences are with IT. And if you're really looking for meaningful improvements, I suggest that you actually do a combination of these things and potentially weight the results of each one into your overall customer satisfaction survey. Now, the second thing that you might want to do is take the customer satisfaction information and then correlate it back to information that you're getting from your ITSM tool. So, for example, if I have low customer satisfaction scores, what I'd like to do is to actually look at some of my other measures that are on the service desk, like mean time to restore service, how well we're solving calls at first point of contact, how well we're solving calls within our service level, and try and build correlations between my low customer satisfaction and the data that I'm seeing on my service desk. And the reason that I might want to do that is that it enables me to implement an improvement plan by saying, okay, if I'm going to impact my client satisfaction, I need to potentially focus on reducing my mean time to restore service from X to Y. Or instead of solving 40% of my calls at customer first contact or first call resolution, I need to move that up to 60%. And then it helps inform changes within the organization that you're going to get to justify the performance improvements that you're looking to make. So I suppose.
And Charles, just a quick thing here is I'm assuming that consumers, customers, end users, you're just using these terms interchangeably.
So it's good point. So we refer to end users as consumers, okay, if they don't pay for the service. So if I'm a general office employee and I'm doing a survey to that general office employee, and that office employee is not physically paying anything for the IT support service, I would typically call them a consumer. By calling that individual a customer, I'm potentially attaching rights, sacred rights, I would say, to that individual that they probably have not earned, and yet they want to wield in many respects. And I think a lot of IT departments get themselves into trouble by calling everybody customers, and then the customers get upset when they're not being treated like customers, they're actually being treated like consumers. However, in certain environments, your end users could be customers. If I'm a university and I'm charging my students tuition fees, my students are, and part of their tuition fees cover the support infrastructure that they're receiving, and they get a laptop, for example. Well, they really are customers. There's a financial transaction that happens. If I'm in a law firm and I'm supporting partners, those partners are owners of the business, and there's a financial transaction that potentially is taking place. Money that is spent in infrastructure in law firms does not go to the partners. So they're giving up funding, and so there's that financial transaction involved. So I would actually call them a customer. However, in most IT support environments, we would typically suggest calling our end users consumers because they're consuming the IT service. They might not be paying for it. If they are paying for it, then they would be customers. If they're not paying for it, we would typically want to call them consumers. The other groups that we've identified as potential stakeholders are our IT practitioners. So our IT practitioners would be split into the service desk itself and then the IT support chain. These are the escalation groups that tickets go to when the service desk can't resolve a particular issue. And then you have executives. And executives in most organizations are in fact the customers. These are the people who you're agreeing your service level agreements with, and ultimately would maintain sort of the customer title. And so if we identify these three groups as the customers, what type of survey would we do with each one? So the consumers, we would typically run two types of survey. We have the transactional survey, and I normally recommend three flavors. A flavor, if we solve the ticket at first call resolution or first point of contact, FPOC or SCR. We have a different type of survey to those consumers if we escalated a ticket, and we have a different type of survey for service requests. We have different surveys for each one of these things is because I want to ask questions that are relevant to the experience the person had, as opposed to generic questions that don't really capture the experience that that person had. And the nice thing is with most tools today, you track whether an issue was solved at first point of contact, whether it was escalated, and whether it was a service request, and so you could trigger the appropriate survey to go out based on the experience that the consumer had. We recommend also to do overall perception surveys where you would have two types of surveys. One for people who have called the service desk and experienced the IT service, and then you'd have a second survey designed for people who haven't called the service desk. Because if they're not using the service, we want to understand why they're not using the service and where they're potentially getting their IT support from. The overall perception scores, you probably would do every year. If you're going through a very rapid service improvement program, you might do it on a 6-monthly basis while you're implementing a lot of changes, but generally you wouldn't go beyond that. For the IT stakeholder groups, you would typically do an overall perception survey with the frontline service desk folks and then the escalation support groups. And then you would potentially do a transactional survey for any ticket that got low client satisfaction. So if you got a very, very low client satisfaction, you might actually send out a survey to the person who resolved that ticket to try and understand what happened from their perspective. But you wouldn't do it for every survey, because otherwise there's just, everyone would just be overwhelmed by the volume of surveys that they would have to fill out. And then executives would typically be surveyed on the overall perception and the state of IT. Just one note on satisfaction versus overall perception surveys. Overall perception really can find out things that might be missed with a transactional survey, and we will explore that maybe a little bit more in our next session. This, I'm not going to go through it right now, but if you get a takeaway of the slide deck, you're going to be able to use this to sort of reference into who exactly the audience is, what the survey looks like, how you might group the results when you're actually doing some of your reports. In terms of designing the question, if your goal is to improve performance, you don't just want to ask about satisfaction, you also want to ask how important is this to you? And the reason for that is that you want to build a matrix of things that people are least satisfied with that potentially are most important to them, and so you can allocate your results there. So for example, a question could be, rate the timeliness of the resolution to your question. And then you're going to rate it based on the satisfaction. The timeliness of the team was maybe a 3. How important is it that I get timeliness resolutions to my questions? That's a 5. And so now when I get my results, I'm going to be able to explore, what that kind of looks like. And I've got an example here of a survey that I actually did with a real organization, real live organization, between their service desk and their escalation groups. And so the top one here is my IT service desk. And one of the things you're going to look at, their overall satisfaction with, hang on a second, their overall satisfaction was a 2.9. Their overall level of importance of IT support was a 4.2. The escalation groups there had a higher level of satisfaction but a low level of importance. This particular organization, it was really interesting to see how that translated into the culture where the escalation groups actually looked down upon the service desk and didn't treat them with a lot of respect. And we'll kind of look at how that might have worked in other results. You don't, to make information relevant over an extended period of time, we want to ask questions that aren't just, on their own, but part of a dimension. The Ontario government went through a big process some years ago in defining survey dimensions. and leveraging sort of some of that work, they came out with survey dimensions that I think were pretty similar to this of timeliness, reliability, responsiveness, accessibility, communication, and cost and value. The key point here is that when you ask your question, you slot it in as part of a dimension. And then what that means is that you can actually swap out your questions over time, but still maintain the integrity of your scoring. For purposes of timing, I go through each dimension, and I'm going to just skip through this for the purposes of this presentation. But again, you're going to be able to refer to this later on when you actually get a copy of the deck if you want to sort of go through it. And it just basically talks about the things that are available to you in each of the dimensions and the types of questions that you would actually ask. One note, in terms of cost and value, if the person isn't paying for the service or there isn't a financial transaction, you wouldn't include, a particular dimension. So this is an example of what it might look like in a report. That rather than measuring my individual question responses, I roll up the questions into my dimensions, and I can start seeing that the areas that people are most concerned about are timeliness, for example. It's got the most importance, and it's got the least level of satisfaction. So when I'm starting to build my service improvement plans, I'm able to prioritize my actions as to what areas I'm going to focus on. So timeliness would be the area that I'm going to put my plans in place for the next 90 days. And then over time, what I would expect to see is that timeliness satisfaction would go up. I actually might even expect the importance to go down a little bit when people aren't feeling the burn. And in other areas, we're going to start seeing other things that we might want to focus on for our next improvement cycle. And again, I'm going to look at the improvement cycle in more detail in our next presentation. Additionally, to really hit the nail on the head.
Sorry, Charles, just a quick time check. I want to make sure if anybody has any questions to post them as well. We're just kind of approaching 12:45 here, and just also there was one other question on the dimensions, and that is, are they typically the same for every organization?
I suggest if you've got low experience in a surveying methodology, you might want to stick with standard dimensions. As you become more experienced, you can actually experiment with the dimensions and actually even create your own dimensions. And certainly you don't have to ask questions for all dimensions on every survey, because otherwise it would just be too unwieldy. You might just pick one or two dimensions in a particular survey, ask those questions, and then next round you might go for some different dimensions. And I am aware of the time. I'm going to be wrapping up very, very shortly, but I just want to talk about a couple more things here. If you really want to hit the nail on the head in terms of improvement, at the end of the survey, you could say, you know what, if you want us to focus on 3 areas that are most important to you in terms of what we should be fixing, rank them for us. And you can actually build an improvement ranking that looks something like this, where 62% of people said their #1 issue was the accuracy and detail of individual incident information when updated by IT groups, for example. And you can kind of take this information and it really can translate very, very easily into an action plan. So the things that we're going to be looking at in our next presentation is taking this information and really applying it into a service and process improvement plan. Just as a preview of some of the things we're going to be looking at is building out what we call tactical trees. And a tactical tree is basically taking a project plan, which is normally just a list of tasks, and apply it into a format that shows you your improvement intent. So in this particular case, I filled one out here, but we're going to really explore how we build this from analyzing our survey results in our next presentation. So in summary, we want to implement customer satisfaction programs around a methodology because you know what, there's really no brownie points to reinventing the wheel, and a lot of great work has really been done on customer service management, client service management. So even if you don't like the methodology that I'm talking about, there are lots to explore, and just heading down to the local library or even an Indigo, or chapters, it provides great insight into some of the things that you could be doing. Be careful not to ask questions that are not relevant to your goals. So it's really important to understand what the goal is, and if you're interested in performance improvement in certain areas, you can really tailor those questions to those specific things. Using multiple data gathering techniques help not get artificially inflated results. So by doing transactional surveys, by doing annual surveys, by potentially bringing in focus groups, you actually will get a more realistic perception or vision of what your overall customer satisfaction or client satisfaction score is. Use client satisfaction results as part of a CSI program as opposed to just doing it as a measure in itself. I see a lot of people who are just measuring client satisfaction, just saying, okay, this is what it is. It's just not as exciting as taking that measure and using it to underpin an improvement program and seeing how the results of your improvement program really impact the satisfaction of your clients. Spend time focusing on how you're going to action the information. A lot of people forget this part. They just focus on the design of the survey and the execution of the survey. Then they get all of this information back, and then they don't know what to do with it. It's much better in advance to plan how you're going to action the information, and that's really where we're going to spend a lot of time in our next session talking about how we do that. Don't be afraid to communicate the results back to stakeholders and share the improvements and actions. A lot of people complain that they get low response rates in surveys. And the reason is that they're always taking the information and not giving anything back. If you give back the results and you tell people about what you did with their information, they're more inclined to do stuff. Now, if you want to try out any of the methodologies that I've kind of talked about, we are giving people access at no charge. If you go to www.thinkitsm.com/ThoughtRock, and you just go and just fill in your name and your company details or whatever else, you will go to a login page, and what will happen is it will show you examples of a business consumer, so a consumer survey, an IT practitioner survey, and an executive satisfaction survey. And so you can actually see what one of these things looks like and some of the questions that we put together in advance. You can take those questions and you can incorporate it into whatever surveying tool you like, or you can even execute surveys directly from this service that we run. So I think with that, I'm going to hand back to Rick and see if there are any questions or comments.
Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, please post them right now. I'm just going to finalize a couple of other things. Just a reminder that this was the first part, as Charles has mentioned, and that he's kind of led into what next week will be about. And again, that is Tuesday, January 22nd, same time, 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And again, next week he'll be discussing how organizations can now implement these systems, execute surveys, and measure results. So Charles, we definitely had a great attendance today. Everybody stayed on the line, so I'm not sure if anybody has questions or they're going to hold them off till next week. You can always send off those questions in advance of next week to us at info@thoughtrock.com, and we'll also make sure that we get them to Charles right away in case there's anything in advance of next week's session. So hopefully we have everybody return next week and come back for part 2. I'm sure with all that base level knowledge, it'll be interesting to see how the implementation and the execution and measuring is done and what Charles' recommendations are there. So Charles, I don't see any other questions that are posted right now, and if we do get them, we'll make sure we get them forwarded off to you. So thanks again for part 1, and we're looking forward to you back next week for part 2.
Thanks, Rick, and thanks everyone for attending.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.